one of the things that I've been thinking about with the early construction and playtesting and feedback of my game Two Lives is how much the game should explain to the player its basic mechanics. Now, this seems like a fairly obvious question. Games should have tutorials, right? Except I actually kind of like the idea of a game that just lets you explore, lets you try out mechanics without really telling you what they are, die a bunch of times, and just figure out the game on your own. So the game that I've been working on is Two Lives, which is essentially a dungeon crawler. We're going to be going through a randomly generated dungeon, opening doors, fighting monsters, and eventually we're going to bite off more than we can chew, and we're going to end up getting killed. And then we're going to drop into this completely different game world where we're now in the same space, but it's a platformer. We have gravity, we have a jetpack, and the goal of the game now, instead of fighting, is to collect these gems and make our way back to the start of the game, this portal which opens up at the start of the game. So that's kind of the basic flow of what this game is about. And the question is, should the game actually tell you that it's going to do that at the start? Or should the game be just letting you experiment and see what happens and learn the mechanics through play? So as an example of that, here is the platformer side of the game, and you can see that there is a prompt down in the corner which just says press A to jump. So the game actually, as I showed before, has a jetpack, right? You can get up by double pressing A or by pressing A in the air. And I had some playtest feedback that was like people weren't discovering the jetpack, or you'll notice that the jetpack actually consumes gems. So if I'm out of gems, I can't use the jetpack. It's a limited finite resource. So once I'm out, the jetpack just doesn't work. You just see this little puff. And I had playtesters that were running out of gems and they were triggering the jetpack once or twice and then it didn't work. And they were like, there seems to be this jetpack that sometimes doesn't work. What's the deal with that? So should players be forced to experiment, first of all, to find out that there is a jetpack by hitting that A button, perhaps in frustration, and finding out about the jetpack organically? And second of all, to understand that the jetpack consumes gems and therefore needs to be a conserved quantity. It's something that a player could discover on their own, but it might take one or two play sessions to really figure out how it's working. And so should the game explain that? Now, I deliberately did not write jump/jetpack down here in the corner because I wanted players to organically discover that. I think the fact that the early playtesters were highlighting this confusion means that they were expecting the game to explain these mechanics, and there was that friction there. And sometimes friction can be good, but if you imagine someone who actually wants to try the game because they're in your Discord or they're your friend telling you that they had this friction and they weren't really sure what was going on, you can imagine that translating to a player who is just trying the game on Steam as a demo. They have no commitment whatsoever, and if they find that they are stuck in a hole and they can't jump out of the hole, and they're just like, well, this game's broken, they'll never be back. So my feeling on this is, even though it is a cool thing for a game to be a bit coy about its mechanics and not explain even these basic things, I think that in a modern setting where we are overwhelmed with games to try and we can't expect players to have a lot of commitment, games really need to kind of meet you halfway and explain to you the mechanics. So I will be putting out a new build where the game now has this jump/jetpack. So just as a little hint that there is something to explore here, there is some mechanic. The other thing that I did in response to this was I added this tip system. So if we just restart the game now, you can see that it says, tip, sometimes it pays to keep chests closed. And the reason for that is that I didn't want the game to have this just explicit tutorial where it pops up and says, now do this, now do this, now do this to learn the mechanics. Instead, I wanted it to be something where you aren't required to experiment necessarily, but you just need to play the game a few times and it will start to explain to you some of its mechanics. And these tips are randomly chosen. If you play through a full run of the game, then the set of tips will expand to cover some more mechanics, and that is essentially where I was aiming to meet players halfway, to say, well, I'm going to just slowly explain the game mechanics to you as you play the game more. So the way that I did this was I created this doc where I went and made a list of all the mechanics that I wanted to that are in the game that are maybe not entirely obvious, and I classified them into 3 categories: basic, intermediate, and advanced. The intermediate and advanced things, I wanted it to be, the idea that I had was that the intermediate mechanics would be the things that are not immediately obvious, but it's going to take a little experimenting to learn. So I'll give you a push by adding some tips to the game. Things like, when you open a chest, it spawns a ghost in the flip world. The fact that you can use a jetpack, that was considered to be an intermediate concept at this point in the game. And then the advanced concepts are more like advice, so tips and tricks, things that are you should learn these by playing the game. So these are tips like the idea that you should generally not be moving south because otherwise it's going to be more difficult to get back up again later when gravity is turned on. So these are things that I don't really think the game should explain to you because they are more like strategies. So, but this is like the idea that I had was that a player would start the game and they would learn essentially these things one by one the more they play the game, and maybe it would take you about 10 runs to fully appreciate all of these techniques and concepts. I think what I discovered though is that players are not going to play the game necessarily 10 times unless they already have an understanding of the mechanics. The appreciation that I've got from this feedback is that I think that a player stumbling into this game with no context is not going to stick around for even maybe 2 or 3 runs to learn all of these things. So I pushed out a build with these tips, and people didn't seem to have read many of them, and I think that's because they played the game 1, 2, or 3 times before they closed the game and gave feedback. So they didn't see all the tips that were available in the game. So my thinking on this has come around to, I do think the game just needs to have a tutorial that explains these concepts, at least these basic and intermediate concepts. You should be able to do one run, a handheld guided run with a tutorial system, and come away understanding all of these basic and intermediate concepts. I think that's a pretty reasonable point to meet the players. And then the advanced concepts are still things I believe the game should let you experience on your own. So the inspiration for this game, one of the main inspirations for Two Lives, was a pretty old game from, I believe, 2011 called Starseed Pilgrim, which is what we have here. And in Starseed Pilgrim, this game is kind of famous for being a mystery box, right? The game does explain in a tutorial up front the basic mechanics, the basic, jumping, planting seeds, which is what you do here, and being able to dig out blocks, which you can do like this. But after that, it doesn't tell you anything. It just lets you play it and see what happens. So when you do, you plant seeds and they grow in random weird orders, all of that is totally unexplained. And things can happen in this game that are good, things can happen that are bad. For example, this is about to become bad, that blue block is about to turn into a yellow block where I can't jump very high, right? So there are so many interesting deep mechanics of this game that you learn through just playing the game over and over again. And that was the idea that I had for Two Lives, is that there would be these systems that are immediately present at the start of the game, but not obvious what they do. And a lot of the game is about this journey of discovery, of planting, doing things, trying them out, seeing what works and what doesn't, and how the mechanics interact, and kind of building it in your mind these interactions until you master the game, and then moving on to actually playing the game at a high level, where the game requires you to know all of these mechanics, what's going on. The other aspect is when you touch the blackness in Starseed Pilgrim, you go into this alternate world, and you can clearly see the inspiration there. In this alternate world, you pick up hearts and you deliver them back to the start. But what I wanted to talk about with relation to Starseed Pilgrim is that it's kind of famous for being this obtuse game that doesn't explain itself properly. And I think that's kind of unfair, because that's one of the cool things about it, is that it doesn't explain itself. It requires you to perform experiments in a scientific way to understand how it works. But it's also, it came out in a different time. It came out in a time where there were really not that many indie games available, and if you got one, I got this in a humble bundle, I think a lot of people probably did way back in the day. If you got one of these, you would probably sit with it for half an hour to an hour at least to try and understand what it was about. These days, I just don't think that people have enough patience. I don't think I would have enough patience to properly appreciate Starseed Pilgrim if I just opened it up in a Steam Next Fest. I would probably move on to another game before I got what was good about it. In 2025, a game probably needs to be a little more explicit and have a tutorial that explains at least its basic mechanics to get the player up to the point where they can appreciate what's cool about it before they move on to the next thing. So, before you move on to the next thing, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video about Two Lives. Oh, and I forgot to mention that if you want to play the prototype, you can actually check it out right now at itch.io. There's a link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.